Before the flames fell on London, before the skies turned red and sirens screamed through the night, Europe was already trembling. It was 1939, a continent standing on the edge of a storm it thought would never return. 20 years after the guns of the Great War had fallen silent, the wounds were still fresh, though half forgotten. Fields that once echoed with artillery were now green again, but beneath the soil, the scars of trench warfare remained, and so did the bitterness. Germany, broken by the Treaty of Versailles, had found a new voice, one that promised greatness, vengeance and unity under a single banner. Adolf Hitler's rise from obscurity to power was swift and ruthless. Through his words, many Germans saw hope, and through his policies, Europe would soon see horror. Factories roared back to life. Armies marched again, and in smoky meeting halls across Berlin, plans were drawn not for peace but for conquest. In Britain, the papers spoke of appeasement. Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain held aloft a paper from Munich declaring peace for our time. But peace was already dying. In March 1939, Hitler seized Czechoslovakia. By September, his tanks rolled into Poland. 2 days later, Britain declared war. The wireless crackled across the nation. This country is at war with Germany. In kitchens, factories, and quiet country lanes, listeners froze. A new generation would fight another world war, one many had sworn would never happen again. In the weeks that followed, trains carried hundreds of thousands of children from the cities to the countryside. Gas masks slung over their shoulders, small hands clutching tags with their names. Operation Pied Piper had begun. For parents waving goodbye at the platforms, the fear was unspoken, but clear. They knew what modern war meant. They had seen its shadows before. May 1940, France, fell in just 6 weeks. German tanks broke through the Ardennes, a place the Allies thought impassable, and swept toward the sea. On the beaches of Dunkirk, 400,000 Allied soldiers were trapped. Churchill called it a colossal military disaster, but what followed became a miracle. The Royal Navy, joined by fishermen, ferry captains, and ordinary civilians, sailed across the channel under fire to bring their boys home. In the smoky chaos of that evacuation, Britain's soul began to harden. Winston Churchill, newly appointed Prime Minister, stood before Parliament and told the nation the truth. "I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat." His words became armor. In them, Britain found a voice for its defiance. Across Europe, occupied nations listened and hoped. Summer 1940. The Channel shimmered under sunlight. But on the French coast, Hitler's armies gathered. Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of Britain, was taking shape. In the fields of Kent and along the cliffs of Dover, soldiers dug trenches and manned lookout posts. Posters urged citizens, "If the invader comes, stand firm." In London, blackout curtains went up, streetlights dimmed. Nighttime would soon belong to the bombers. Then came the sound, a low hum that grew to a roar. August 1940 marked the start of the Battle of Britain. In small silver Spitfires and sturdy Hurricanes, young RAF pilots, many still in their teens, rose to meet the Luftwaffe. Dogfights blazed above the Channel. The outcome of the entire war hung in those summer skies. Never in the field of human conflict, Churchill would later say, was so much owed by so many to so few. They were the shield that kept the invasion at bay. When the Luftwaffe failed to break the RAF, Hitler changed tactics. If he couldn't crush Britain from the air militarily, he would try to destroy its spirit. On the night of September 7, 1940, the first wave of the Blitz began. The target, London. The Thames glowed with the reflection of flames. Warehouses burned. Docks exploded, and the city's skyline vanished in smoke. For 57 nights in a row, the bombs fell. Yet even as destruction rained from above, the people endured. In tube stations deep underground, families huddled on platforms, sharing food, stories, and songs. Children drew chalk games beside the rails. Some slept to the rhythm of distant explosions. Up above, firefighters, nurses, and volunteers raced through the night. An unseen army against chaos. Their courage was quiet but unbreakable by dawn. London would rise from its ashes again. Smoke drifted over the Thames. But the Union Jack still flew above Buckingham Palace. Britain had not fallen. It had been tested, and in the test, it had discovered something immortal. We shall never surrender. Those words were not just Churchill's. They were the heartbeat of a nation standing alone against darkness. After the fall of France, the map of Europe seemed to belong to the swastika. From the Arctic Circle to the Pyrenees, Nazi banners fluttered over conquered capitals, and only the narrow English Channel stood between Hitler and total domination of the continent. The Führer believed Britain was beaten, that its people were weary of war and its leaders too proud to face reality. Yet on the other side of that shimmering strip of water, Britain was not preparing to surrender. It was preparing to fight for its life. In Berlin, generals and engineers gathered around vast tables covered in blueprints. They spoke of invasion craft, of tides and winds, of the 1,000 details that could turn the channel into a graveyard or a highway to conquest. Hitler named the plan Unternehmen Seelöwe, Operation Sea Lion. It was to be the greatest amphibious invasion the world had ever seen, an armada of barges carrying divisions of soldiers to the English coast. But behind the confidence lay hesitation. The German Navy knew it lacked the ships. The Air Force insisted that first it must destroy the Royal Air Force, for no invasion could succeed while British fighters ruled the skies. In Britain, the mood was defiant. The memory of Dunkirk was still raw, yet it had kindled a strange pride. "We may be small, but we are not broken," a London dock worker told a reporter. Families patched up bomb shelters in their gardens, schools practiced air raid drills, and volunteers joined the Home Guard, men too old or too young for regular service, armed with little more than broom handles and courage. Posters appeared on every wall, "Keep calm and carry on." Over the summer of 1940, the Luftwaffe began its assault. Day after day, German bombers crossed the Channel, aiming to crush the RAF before the invasion fleet could sail. High above the fields of Kent, the battles raged. Silver arcs of Spitfires twisting against the dark shapes of Messerschmitts. Many of the pilots were scarcely 20 years old, their faces still boyish beneath oxygen masks, yet they fought with the intensity of men who knew the fate of their country rested on their wings. Ground crews worked through the night, repairing planes by lantern light, sleeping only when exhaustion overcame them. When dawn came, the pilots returned to the air. Londoners listened to the distant growl of engines and counted the contrails that streaked across the sky. "Another dogfight," they would murmur, half with fear, half with pride. Churchill visited airfields, shaking hands with the young men he called the few. When he later told Parliament, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few," the phrase carried the gratitude of a nation. Hitler watched the struggle from afar, growing impatient. The RAF refused to die. Bombers that should have been hitting airfields now turned toward London, hoping terror would succeed where tactics had failed. Night after night, the city burned. Firefighters battled infernos. Families huddled in the underground while bombs thundered overhead. But every morning, milk carts still rattled down the streets. Newspapers still printed and church bells still rang. By October, Hitler quietly postponed Operation Sea Lion. The invasion barges rusted in French ports, never to cross the Channel. Britain had survived the storm. The island that was meant to fall had instead become a fortress, a beacon to every occupied nation watching from the shadows. The courage of the few had turned the tide. For the first time in the war, Nazi Germany had been stopped. The skies over Britain remained a battlefield long after Hitler called off his invasion. The Luftwaffe sought vengeance, striking not only at London but at every city that defied the Reich. Coventry, Birmingham, Liverpool, each took its turn beneath the falling fire. The pattern was always the same: the wail of sirens, the whistle of descending bombs, the rush of air as explosions tore through stone and glass. Yet the rhythm of life continued. Children played among the ruins. Shopkeepers swept broken glass from doorways and reopened before noon. For the Royal Air Force, the struggle entered a new phase. Radar stations along the coast pulsed invisible waves into the night, guiding fighters toward approaching squadrons. Pilots learned to trust the strange new technology that could see through darkness and cloud. Women joined the ranks of the WWII, the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, tracking enemy raids from plotting rooms deep underground. The war was no longer fought only by men in cockpits. It was fought by the unseen hands that directed them. Each sortie told its own story. Squadron leader Douglas Bader, who flew with artificial legs after a pre-war accident, became a symbol of unyielding spirit. Polish and Czech pilots, exiles from conquered homelands, fought with a ferocity born of loss. Over the radio they called for Poland, and Britain claimed them as brothers. The battle for the skies became a duel of endurance. The Luftwaffe could bomb by night, but Britain could rebuild by day. Railways cleared debris, engineers repaired runways, and by dusk the fighters were ready again. Hitler had promised his people the quick destruction of Britain's air defense. Instead, the campaign stretched on, bleeding Germany's strength. By the winter of 1940-41, it was clear the RAF still stood, and the British people had learned to live beneath the bombs. The enemy could destroy buildings but not resolve. As one London woman wrote in her diary, "We sleep when we can, laugh when we must, and carry on because there is no other choice." The first night of the Blitz came without warning. On September 7, 1940, the sirens wailed at dusk, and within minutes, the sky above London filled with the dull, droning heartbeat of engines. People looked upward, waiting for the whistle of the first bomb. When it came, it split the night like thunder. Warehouses along the docks exploded into sheets of flame. The Thames shimmered red, and the city, one of the oldest in the world, seemed to catch fire all at once. Everywhere, people ran for cover. Some hurried toward the underground stations, clutching children and blankets. Others stayed in their homes, trusting the little shelters in their back gardens. Firemen clambered over smoking rubble, dragging hoses through streets that only hours earlier had been calm and ordinary. The air reeked of smoke and dust and fear. Yet amid the chaos, something remarkable began to appear, a calm, stubborn endurance that defied logic. Night after night, the bombs returned. For 57 consecutive evenings, London was hammered from the sky. Whole neighborhoods vanished. Ancient churches were reduced to piles of stone. Buses lay twisted in the streets. But even as the devastation grew, the city refused to die. Each morning, milkmen delivered bottles to doorsteps, balancing their carts around craters. Trains resumed their schedules. Postmen carried letters through streets still lined with smoking ruins. In the tube stations, life took on a strange rhythm. Families slept shoulder to shoulder on the platforms, reading newspapers by candlelight. Children played, soldiers dozed, couples whispered prayers. Volunteers organized soup kitchens underground. One mother later wrote, "It was like living in another world, one below the bombs and one above them, but both somehow alive." The Blitz was destroying London's buildings, but it was forging something stronger: unity. As the winter deepened, the city adapted. Windows were taped against shattering glass. Wardens patrolled rooftops to douse sparks before they grew into fires. When the all-clear siren finally sounded each morning, Londoners would emerge from the darkness, blinking in the pale daylight, brushing dust from their coats. They counted themselves lucky even if their homes were gone. Survival itself had become victory. By spring, the capital looked like a scarred giant, its skyline ragged, its heart still beating. Across the ocean, America watched with growing awe. The world began to see that Britain, though small and battered, would not yield. And in that steadfastness, democracy found its symbol. Through the long months of the Blitz, the people of Britain discovered a strength they had not known they possessed. It was not the strength of armies or weapons. but the quiet power of endurance, the belief that somehow tomorrow would come. Each evening, as the sun slipped behind the smoldering horizon, London prepared again. Curtains were drawn tight, candles were blown out, and families descended once more into the tunnels. There were moments of fear, of course, terrible moments when the earth shook and ceilings caved in, but there were also moments of laughter. Soldiers sang, children told jokes. A man played a violin in one corner of the station, and for a brief moment, everyone forgot the war. Churchill visited bombed neighborhoods, walking among the ruins, his hat pulled low against the wind. When he raised two fingers in the sign of victory, crowds cheered, not because they believed victory was near, but because they saw in him their own courage reflected back. "We can take it," he had said of the British people. And now they proved him right. Firefighters, ambulance drivers, nurses, these became the unsung heroes of the Blitz. They worked through exhaustion, often without sleep, crawling through debris to reach survivors. In one night's raid, more than 1,000 fires were reported across the city, and still the brigades fought on, their hoses hissing steam against molten brick. The courage of these men and women was rarely seen on newsreels, but it kept the city alive. Beyond London, other towns suffered their own nights of terror. Coventry was flattened in a single raid. Liverpool's docks blazed for days. Plymouth and Bristol burned. Yet the spirit was the same everywhere, a stubborn refusal to surrender to despair. Even in the smallest villages, blackout curtains hid windows, but not resolve. By 1941, when the raids finally eased, Britain had been transformed. The old barriers between class and gender began to blur. Rich and poor, men and women, all had shared the same shelters, the same danger, the same grief. The war had leveled not only buildings, but divisions. Out of the rubble, a new sense of unity was born, a conviction that when peace returned, it must be a peace built on fairness, compassion, and endurance. In that unity lay the nation's true victory. The bombs had failed to crush the spirit of its people. Instead, they had tempered it like steel. The world would remember those months not for the destruction they brought, but for the defiance they inspired. The Blitz had not broken Britain. It had revealed her soul. When history remembers the Blitz, it often speaks of bombers and bunkers, of leaders and speeches. But in the fiery nights when the skies poured death over Britain, another army fought a quieter, more relentless war. A war not against soldiers, but against fire itself. These were the men and women of the Auxiliary Fire Service, the Ambulance Corps, and the countless volunteers who faced the inferno head-on. They were ordinary people who became extraordinary through duty and courage. Every night, when the sirens wailed, the firefighters climbed into their engines and raced toward the glow on the horizon. They didn't flee the flames, they ran toward them. Streets they had known all their lives turned into rivers of molten glass, collapsing walls and choking smoke. Yet they pressed on, their faces blackened with soot, their eyes red from exhaustion. In those long, terrible hours, London's survival depended not on generals or politicians, but on these anonymous heroes who refused to let the city burn. The fires were monstrous, devouring everything in their path. Whole blocks became furnaces, and the heat was so fierce that lead from church roofs melted and flowed into the streets. Water mains burst, leaving crews to draw from ponds, rivers, or even shattered pipes beneath the ground. They formed human chains, passing buckets hand to hand, the glow of flames reflected in their eyes. Many fought until their boots melted or their hoses ran dry. They slept where they fell, too tired to return home, only to rise again when the sirens started anew. There were no uniforms of glory here. Their helmets were dented, their coats scorched. But to the people of London, they were knights of courage. Children waved to them from shelters. Mothers whispered blessings as they passed. They brought not only water to the flames, but hope to the hopeless. In the midst of destruction, their presence was a reminder that the city still had guardians, that humanity had not surrendered to chaos. Alongside them worked the rescue services, men who crawled through ruins to pull the trapped and injured from the wreckage. Sometimes they found life, sometimes only silence. They carried bodies gently with the reverence of priests. Each life saved, each hand held in the darkness, became an act of defiance. The ambulance drivers, many of them young women, braved bomb-cratered streets to reach the wounded. Their vehicles had no armor. Their lights were dimmed to near blackness, but they drove on through falling debris, trusting instinct more than sight. In their courage, the front lines of the war shifted. The battlefield was no longer just in the skies or across the channel. It was every burning street, every shattered home. In the heart of the chaos, London's cathedrals and churches became symbols of endurance. On December 29, 1940, St. Paul's Cathedral nearly perished. The city burned all around it. Flames leapt across rooftops. Bombs fell within yards of its great dome. Yet through the smoke, the cathedral stood, its cross gleaming faintly in the glow. A photographer captured the image, St. Paul's surrounded by fire, and when it appeared in the morning papers, it became the symbol of hope for the entire nation. The firefighters had saved it, risking everything to keep the flames from reaching its foundation. That image, that moment, reminded the world that beauty and faith could survive even in the heart of destruction. These were not soldiers in uniform or men of rank. They were bakers, laborers, clerks, and teachers. Many had never imagined they would one day face a war, let alone fight one in their own streets. Yet when the bombs fell, they stood their ground. They did not ask for glory, only for strength to face the next night. When dawn came after the raids, they gathered quietly, sharing cigarettes and silence. The city still smoked, but the fires had been beaten back once more. Their work was invisible to history's headlines, but it was carved into the soul of the nation. In the years that followed, when medals were handed out and speeches made, many of these heroes had already returned to ordinary life. They did not seek remembrance, yet remembrance found them. Every child who grew up in a city that still stood owed them a debt. Every church that remained standing, every home rebuilt, carried their legacy in its walls. They were proof that heroism does not always roar from the battlefield. Sometimes it whispers in the hiss of water on flame, in the footsteps of a rescuer moving through smoke, in the steady hands of someone who refuses to give up. In the darkest nights of the Blitz, it was these hands that held Britain together. War is fought not only with guns and planes, but with words, images, and the human spirit. As bombs fell and cities burned, Britain understood that survival required more than defense. It required belief. Belief in victory, in endurance, in the quiet dignity of carrying on. And so, in the midst of ruin, a different kind of battle began. The war for morale. The British government, through its Ministry of Information, became the unseen hand behind this effort. It crafted slogans, posters, and films to steady the public's resolve. Keep calm and carry on. Your courage, your cheerfulness, your resolution will bring us victory. These phrases were simple, but they echoed across the nation. Painted on walls, printed in papers, and whispered in shelters. They became mantras, not commands from authority, but affirmations of identity. Cinema, too, became a weapon of endurance. In the flickering light of projectors, audiences found escape, courage, and connection. Newsreels showed footage of bombed neighborhoods being cleared, of factory workers smiling as they built the engines of war. Behind the camera, directors like Humphrey Jennings captured the poetry of perseverance. Ordinary people doing extraordinary things without fanfare. His film London Can Take It became an anthem for the Blitz spirit, seen not only in Britain but across the Atlantic, where it stirred hearts in America. Radio was the nation's companion through the darkness. Families gathered around wireless sets, their faces lit by the glow of dials, listening to the familiar voices of announcers who spoke calmly, even as the world above shook. Music filled the spaces between fear and silence. Vera Lynn's voice, warm and steady, drifted through the night. We'll meet again, don't know where, don't know when. For many, it was more than a song. It was a promise. Propaganda in wartime is often seen as manipulation, but in those desperate months, it was something gentler, a lifeline. It gave people the courage to rise from the rubble, to sweep their doorsteps, to plant flowers beside craters. Even laughter became a form of resistance. Cartoonists drew jokes about Hitler's failures. Radio comedians mocked the Luftwaffe's aim. The British sense of humor, dry and defiant, became another defense against despair. The government's message was consistent. The war was not just a fight for territory, but for values, freedom, decency, and the right to live without fear. "Careless talk costs lives," one poster warned, reminding citizens that even gossip could endanger soldiers. Another showed a soldier's weary face beneath the words, "He's doing his part. Are you?" Everywhere, from the post office to the pub, the war's message surrounded the people. Yet behind the posters and the propaganda, there was something deeper taking shape, a collective faith in endurance. When Churchill spoke on the radio, his words carried not just leadership but defiance wrapped in poetry. "We shall fight on the beaches. We shall never surrender." Those sentences were not mere speeches. They were incantations, spoken into the very soul of the nation. Perseverance became an art form. Factory workers labored through fatigue to produce aircraft and ammunition. Women took jobs once reserved for men, welding, assembling, driving trucks. Farmers tilled every inch of soil under the Dig for Victory campaign. School children collected scrap metal and old pots to be melted down for weapons. Even in the smallest gestures, the will to endure became visible, and across the ocean, the world began to notice. American journalists wrote of Britain's quiet courage. Photographs of Londoners sipping tea amid ruins appeared in newspapers worldwide. The Blitz spirit became legendary, not because it denied fear, but because it faced fear with grace. As 1941 drew to a close, the raids began to lessen. The nights grew quieter, the fires fewer, but the spirit that had carried the people through the darkness did not fade. It had become part of who they were. The bombs had tested Britain's body. Propaganda had fortified its heart. Together they had forged a people who believed, unshakably, that freedom was worth any price. In every poster, every film, every song that echoed from the wireless, one message endured: Britain could take it. And as history would show, Britain did. By the spring of 1941, Britain had endured the unendurable. The Blitz had scarred its cities, its families, and its knights. But from the ashes rose something the enemy had not foreseen. Resilience hardened into resolve. The people had bent, but they had not broken. And though the bombs still fell, there was a shift in the air, a sense that perhaps, at last, the tide might be turning. The German High Command had believed that bombing Britain into submission would pave the way for invasion. But night after night, as the Luftwaffe's formations thundered overhead, Britain refused to yield. Instead, radar, discipline, and unrelenting determination had turned chaos into control. The Royal Air Force, bloodied but unbowed, had learned the rhythms of the enemy. Fighter pilots once scrambling blindly now intercepted raids with deadly precision. The lessons of 1940, bought with fire and sacrifice, were paying dividends. Deep beneath London, in the secret rooms of the War Cabinet and the tunnels of the Air Ministry, strategies shifted. Churchill and his generals began to look eastward, to Russia, where Hitler had turned his ambition, and across the Atlantic, where America stood watching. Britain's isolation was ending. The enemy's attention was scattering. What had once been a desperate struggle for survival was becoming part of a much greater war. But the turning point was not just strategic, it was spiritual. For months, the British had lived on courage alone, with no promise that victory would ever come. Now, faint signs of hope began to appear. Supply convoys from Canada and the United States braved the Atlantic to deliver food, arms, and fuel. The Atlantic lifeline, as Churchill called it, pulsed like a heartbeat between continents. Every ship that arrived safely at Liverpool or Glasgow was a quiet triumph. Every sailor who guided it through the U-boat-infested waters was a hero unseen. In April 1941, the Luftwaffe shifted its focus. The bombing of London slowed and the raids moved to other cities: Belfast, Plymouth, Liverpool. The pain spread, but so too did the knowledge that the capital was no longer burning alone. Unity deepened. Towns sent aid to one another. Volunteers traveled across counties to help rebuild bombed neighborhoods. Britain was no longer a collection of cities. It was one body, enduring together. The Battle of Britain, once a fight for the skies, had become a battle of endurance. And endurance was something the British had mastered. The blackout continued, the ration books remained, the sirens still wailed, yet life went on. Couples married in bombed-out churches. Children returned to reopen schools. Markets bustled, trains ran, music played. It was a defiance built not of noise, but of normality. The Luftwaffe's power, once overwhelming, began to wane. Losses mounted, fuel grew scarce, and German morale faltered. The skies over England, once dark with wings, began to clear. In June 1941, Hitler made his fateful decision to invade the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa. The war that had consumed Britain now stretched eastward, and the relentless assault on British cities slowed to a crawl. For the first time in months, the nights grew quiet enough for sleep. But quiet did not mean peace. Beneath the calm, Britain began to transform. New factories rose from the ruins. The RAF expanded. Scientific minds turned their attention to radar, cryptography, and the growing network of intelligence that would one day crack the Enigma code. The seeds of eventual victory were being planted, not in glory but in patience and persistence. Churchill sensed the shift. His speeches changed tone, no longer the desperate rallying cries of survival, but the beginnings of confidence. "This is not the end," he said in late 1941. "It is not even the beginning of the end, but it is perhaps the end of the beginning." The nation understood. The darkest chapter was closing and a new one was opening, one written not in fear, but in determination. The turning point of the Blitz was not a single battle or date. It was the moment when a people who had been victims realized they were victors in spirit. The bombs had sought to crush their hearts. Instead, they had forged steel within them. From that steel came innovation, unity, and an unbreakable will to see the war through to the very end. The fires of the Blitz had once lit the skies in destruction. Now they burned as embers of resolve, glowing quietly in the hearts of millions who refused to surrender. Britain had not only survived, it had begun to fight back. When the fires of the Blitz finally dimmed, the rest of the world could no longer look away. What had once been a European conflict had become a human one. Across oceans and continents, radio waves carried the sound of air raid sirens, Churchill's graveled voice, and the heartbeat of a nation refusing to die. The world began to respond, not only with sympathy, but with action. In Washington, President Roosevelt listened to London's broadcasts late into the night. He knew the struggle unfolding was not merely Britain's fight for survival. It was civilization's stand against tyranny. "We must be the arsenal of democracy," he declared. And with those words, America's factories stirred awake. Steel mills roared, shipyards flamed, and assembly lines moved like arteries pumping life across the Atlantic. Crates marked for Britain left the docks of New York and Boston. Rifles, aircraft engines, food, fuel. It was help, wrapped in hope. From the frozen plains of Canada came pilots who volunteered for the Royal Air Force, their breath turning to mist as they trained under foreign skies. In Australia and New Zealand, families sent sons halfway around the world, believing that defending London's night was defending their own dawn. India, Africa, and the Caribbean, then parts of the empire, offered manpower, materials, and the promise of solidarity. The war had ceased to be bounded by geography. It was now bound by conscience. The Atlantic, vast and merciless, became the bridge that connected those who believed in freedom. But it was also a graveyard. German U-boats prowled the depths, turning the sea lanes into killing fields. Merchant sailors, many barely older than boys, faced the terror of torpedoes in the dark. Every convoy that made it through carried not just supplies, but the morale of nations. When one ship was lost, the world mourned. When one arrived, the world rejoiced. In the United States, isolationist voices still warned against joining another European war. Yet newsreels showing Londoners emerging from the rubble each morning began to shift hearts. Americans saw mothers sweeping glass from their kitchen floors, children laughing beneath barrage balloons, firemen carrying the wounded through smoke. Courage, it seemed, spoke louder than politics. And when the Lend-Lease Act passed in early 1941, it signaled that America's neutrality was ending in everything but name. Meanwhile, far to the east, another storm was gathering. Hitler's armies rolled toward Moscow, and Japan's ambitions stretched across the Pacific. The war Britain had endured alone was about to engulf the planet. The alliance that would shape the modern world, Britain. The Soviet Union, and eventually the United States, was forming, not from convenience but from necessity. In London's bomb-scarred streets, the arrival of American reporters and foreign correspondents brought new eyes to old ruins. Photographs of St. Paul's standing unbroken amid fire appeared on front pages from New York to Sydney. The image became a universal symbol, defiance in the face of annihilation. Around it, relief campaigns blossomed. Canadian towns adopted bombed British cities, sending money and clothing. Children overseas collected coins and letters for our friends in Britain. Humanity, fragmented by distance, was beginning to knit itself together again. By late 1941, with the entry of the United States after Pearl Harbor, Britain was no longer an isolated fortress. The world had truly responded. American soldiers trained in British fields, their laughter mingling with the hum of Spitfires overhead. New factories produced tanks and bombers by the hour. Shared intelligence flowed between codebreakers at Bletchley Park and cryptographers in Washington. The war effort became a symphony, chaotic, immense, but united in purpose. Yet even as hope grew, the cost was still counted in lives. Convoys sank, cities burned, and Europe remained under occupation. The world's response was not instant salvation. It was endurance amplified. The flames that had once consumed London now illuminated a global struggle. For the first time, humanity saw that victory could not belong to one nation. It must be shared, or not at all. And so Britain, once a lone island battered by bombs, became the beating heart of an alliance that would one day liberate the world. The world had answered Britain's cry not with pity, but with partnership. The echoes of that solidarity still resound in every monument, every poppy, and every story told beneath quiet skies. When the smoke finally lifted over Britain's cities, silence returned. But it was not the same silence that had come before the bombs. It was heavier, wiser, carrying the echoes of sirens, prayers, and whispered goodbyes. Streets once blackened with soot filled again with laughter and traffic. Flowers pushed through the rubble. Bells rang where roofs had once collapsed. The Blitz had ended, but its story was far from over. Its true legacy lived not in destruction, but in what survived it, the human spirit that refused to yield. In London, entire neighborhoods had vanished, yet people rebuilt them brick by brick. Families returned to where their homes had stood, planting gardens in the craters left by bombs. Children who had once huddled in underground stations now played among scaffolds and new foundations, their laughter mingling with the sound of hammers and saws. Hope, once an act of resistance, became a way of life. The scars of the city remained visible, but they were worn with pride, like medals of endurance. Across Britain, the memory of those nights shaped a generation. They had seen the worst humanity could inflict, and they had answered with courage that astonished even themselves. Artists captured it in paintings of smoke and light. Poets described it in verses of sorrow and grace. Musicians wrote symphonies to the rhythm of falling bombs and rising hearts. And when filmmakers later recreated those nights, they found that truth itself was more dramatic than any fiction, because every face in the crowd had been a story of survival. The government that had once urged its people to keep calm and carried those words into policy. Out of the ruins came reforms, better housing, public health systems, and the promise that such suffering would not be in vain. The war had equalized hardship. In peace, many hoped it would also equalize opportunity. The welfare state, born in the ashes of the Blitz, was one of its most enduring children, a national vow that courage in darkness would be rewarded with compassion in daylight. Beyond Britain's shores, the legacy rippled outward. The images of St. Paul's Cathedral, standing defiant amid the flames, became symbols for all nations that faced tyranny. The Blitz taught the world that air power could devastate cities, but not the will of the people who lived in them. In the decades that followed, as new conflicts arose, veterans and survivors shared their memories not to glorify war, but to warn against it. Their stories became lessons in endurance, empathy, and peace. Even generations later, when the last survivors gathered for anniversaries, they could still recall the smell of smoke, the taste of rationed tea, and the feeling of holding a stranger's hand in the dark. Some spoke of fear, others of faith. Most simply spoke of life, ordinary, precious, and unstoppable. To them, the Blitz was not just history. It was proof of what humanity could endure and still remain human. Modern London carries that legacy in every corner. Beneath its glass towers and busy stations lie the foundations of a city reborn from fire. Monuments mark where bombs once fell. Plaques tell the names of those who did not live to see the dawn. Tourists walk past them, unaware perhaps that beneath their feet are the echoes of those who once waited for the all-clear. Yet the spirit of those nights still whispers through the city's rhythm, a steady pulse that says, "We are still here." Across the world, historians continue to uncover new letters, diaries, and photographs, small windows into those who lived through Britain's darkest hour. Each discovery adds a new voice to the chorus of memory. The nurse who worked without sleep for 3 days, the pilot who saw dawn through smoke, the mother who read bedtime stories beneath concrete ceilings. Their stories remind us that history is not built by generals alone, but by ordinary hearts that refuse to give up. The Blitz was a tragedy, but it was also a revelation. It revealed that unity is stronger than fear, that compassion can survive catastrophe, and that courage often hides in the quietest acts. A cup of tea shared, a song sung softly in a shelter, a candle lit in defiance of the dark. Those truths outlasted the war. They became part of who we are. As the camera pans over modern London, the Thames glinting in the sun, children running where once there was ruin, the narrator's voice softens. The war is long over, but the memory remains, not as a wound, but as a warning and a light. The Blitz taught the world that even in its darkest hour, humanity can shine. And so the story ends where it began, a city under fire, a people under threat, and the unbreakable will that rose from the flames. The bombs have fallen silent, but the spirit they awakened still speaks, to every generation that faces fear and chooses hope instead. This was Britain's darkest hour, and yet in its defiance, it became its brightest.